Hi, so welcome everyone to the fifth session in our JTRC webinar series, Justice in Low Carbon Transitions. So my name is Edouard Morena. I'm a lecturer at the University of London Institute in Paris, and I've also been involved in the Just Transition Research Collaborative with Dunja Krause, who is the organizer of these webinar series. So just a few words first. I mean, the webinar series is actually organized, as I said, by the Just Transition Research Collaborative in partnership with the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, with support as well from the Rosa Luxembourg Foundation. And so today's session actually forms part of a series of webinars whose ambition is effectively to just share some of our thinking and reflections on a range of aspects of just transition that we feel are relevant to advance justice in climate policies and decarbonization efforts. And so today's, the theme for today's webinar is community-based action for just transitions. And you may actually wonder why we chose to focus on communities, given that the concept of just transition is more often than not associated with organized labor and trade unions. So I would just basically, as a kind of a brief introduction, I'd like to advance maybe two kind of main reasons for this. The first, I guess, is that a growing number of frontline groups and community groups are actually mobilizing the just transition concept. And this is particularly the case in the United States. And you find a lot of frontline groups and community movements who are actually using kind of the just transition concept, and actually thinking and developing even just transition frameworks in order to kind of organize and structure their work. The second reason is that we feel that far from being isolated, community-based and workplace efforts to address the climate crisis actually have a lot in common. And we firmly believe that just transition can actually play a positive role in kind of building bridges and dialogue between, on the one hand, what is generally presented as kind of labor environmentalism, but it kind of involves kind of labor movements and unions in the environmental and climate debate. And on the other hand, environmental justice groups and activism that really focuses more on kind of community and frontline community action, and that also incorporates, beyond kind of social justice, also incorporates other justice related issues such as race, gender, but also indigenous rights. And I guess, and I'd just like to refer briefly to a really good paper that I read actually quite recently. I wish I'd read it earlier, by Stefania Barca and Emanuele Leonardi. The title of the paper is Working Class Ecology and Union Politics. It was published in 2018 in Globalization's journal. And what I find really interesting is that how they argue that beyond their differences, labor-based and community-based efforts actually share three important things in common. And so I'd just like to just briefly go through these before presenting our speakers. The first is that both labor-based and community-based efforts put inequalities at the top of the environmental agenda. So they all focus on this kind of notion of inequalities. So it's kind of a shared kind of concept, and it's a shared issue, I guess. The second is that environmental justice activism is also, according to the authors, effectively a working class struggle. And so as they say, and I quote them, even though reflecting an extended concept of class that goes beyond income and occupation to incorporate subaltern positionalities. And finally, as they say, in a post-Fordist world, working class environmentalism needs to include the struggles of unorganized, unwaged, migrant, informal workers, and also factor in community struggles. So I guess, I find this paper interesting because it also shows how there are kind of connections, I guess, between community-based mobilizations around the environment and around climate change and labor-based efforts to address, the climate crisis. And as I said previously, I feel that just transition as a concept is an interesting concept because it it has the potential of kind of creating bridges between community and between and organized labor on the other hand. So I guess the purpose of today's session is really to kind of explore these connections by looking at, what community-based struggles involve, but also what they can more generally bring to the kind of broader debate around just transition. And so to do this, I am joined today by an excellent group of panelists who will share some of their insights, reflections, but also lived experiences with us. And so after this initial kind of round of presentations by today's panelists, we will then have some time for questions and answers. But just before we start, I'd just like to make a few brief announcements. The first is that this session will be recorded and live streamed via the UNRISD YouTube channel, where it will remain available afterwards. And so you can also, in fact, find the recordings of past sessions there in case you missed them. You will also see that we have enabled both a general chat box and a Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. So please use the Q&A box for questions you would like to pose directly to one or several or more of the speakers, and put any general comments or information you would like to share into the chat box. For the questions put into the Q&A box, you will also have a chance to vote or like for the different questions put forward, which will help us to identify those questions that most people would like to see answered. And again, just before we begin, at the very end of the webinar, you will also we will also share a link to a very short 3-question feedback survey. So we would really greatly appreciate if you could fill that in. So without further ado, let me present our first speaker today, Lizeth Chacon, who is an immigrant from Chihuahua, Mexico, who came to the United States at the age of 12. She was first of her family to graduate from a college or university. So I think it was University of Colorado, and she obtained 2 bachelor's degrees, one in political science and one in criminal justice. Having witnessed the many difficulties and injustices immigrants face, she got involved in social justice and particularly immigrants' rights movements early on. In 2013, Lizeth was awarded a mayoral proclamation as a woman in leadership by the mayor of Aurora. And in 2014, she became a founding board member of the Aurora Welcome Center, now called Village Exchange Center. In the fall of 2014, she became the executive director of Rights for All People. And in 2015, she led the Union of Rights for All People and Colorado Progressive Coalition to create and become the founding executive director of the Colorado People's Alliance. And just finally, Lizeth is also the founding executive director of the Colorado People's Action. So Lizeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for having me. I'm gonna just be talking a little bit about the work that we've been doing here in Colorado to move to just transition, and specifically focusing on the direction that our organization takes as a grassroots organization. And so, Colorado People's Alliance is a grassroots organization that's member-led, and it's also a racial justice organization. So what that means is that we do all of our work with people who are directly impacted by the issues, because we believe that those who are closest to the pain are closest to the solution. And we also do our work through a racial justice lens, because ultimately we believe that structural oppression is the root cause to all of the issues that we're working on. We're a multi-issue organization, and so that also brings a unique perspective and community into the work that we're doing on climate justice. We work on economic justice issues, particularly focusing on organizing with minimum wage workers, gig economy workers, and right now we've been doing a lot of work to really protect essential workers during the COVID pandemic. And we also do work on immigrant rights organizing, specifically organizing with undocumented youth and undocumented adults here in the United States, to really push for, protections for our immigrant community. And we've been doing a lot of work to stop, private prisons from making money out of the incarceration of our immigrant community as well. And in our climate justice work, you can see that those two kind of other issues come into the middle, right? Into how we approach climate justice organizing and how we think about a just transition here in Colorado for us. That we really believe that we need to approach the work through really focusing on the impact that corporate polluters and also, environmental hazards are having in our community, and the fact that the communities who are most disproportionately impacted are communities of color and our low-income communities, and that we cannot approach a just transition without really lifting the voices and prioritizing the interest of disproportionately impacted communities, but also impacted workers. A transition that does not lead with the voices of workers and disproportionately impacted communities will not be a transition that works, and will be a transition that creates a new economy that's actually leaving a huge sector of our community behind. And so that is the approach that we take when we look at just transition. And some of the work that we've been doing in Colorado, I think, Edouard, you were talking about it, right? That there's, in the United States, there's a lot of groups like ours, right? That have kind of taken the work on the climate justice space to really think about our just transition. And I think that that has shifted a lot in the United States to really think about how we do this differently. And so in Colorado, we kind of brought together the different sectors in this work, because prior to that, we saw that we were kind of not divided, but we were actually not really talking to each other. We were disagreeing with each other a lot, right? But we were not actually coming together to think about, like, where's the disagreement coming from? And actually, how do we lift up the places where we agree on how do we move to a just transition so we can actually get this work done? And so we brought, for almost 9 months, we brought together the unions in our state. We brought together the green groups, the conservation groups, other grassroots groups, and other faith groups. And we had a consultant that brought us together, had with us different sessions and different conversations, and we came up with our principles. Some of us had the goal to actually pass actual policy, but I think the most important part of those conversations was for us to actually build relationships with each other, where, if there was a ballot measure or a bill at the legislature or something different where we disagreed, that we didn't just go in public and called each other out, right? But that actually we could pick up the phone and say, hey, like, this is going to impact my community in this way. So did you think about it when you were proceeding with this, right? And so really shifting for us to, like, build transformational relationships with each other across sectors so we could bring something together. And so our principles are 4 main principles, and I'm just gonna read them off, but it's life-sustaining work for all. So really focused on workers, timely and responsible transition off of fossil fuels, protection of natural resources, equity and justice by and for impacted communities. And so really looking at the 4 sort of spheres of how we needed to approach a just transition. And then after that work, we worked really closely with the AFL-CIO, one of our unions here in Colorado, the AFL-CIO Colorado. And we actually worked on a bill together at the legislature where Colorado actually became the first state in the country to establish an Office of Just Transition for coal workers. And so that was a huge step, and we hope that other states across the country will take lead of really focusing of how do we not just do and think about the transition from the outside sphere, right? But actually bring it into conversations with our government and our legislature to really think about how do we move this and how do we get our states to actually put resources on the table to think about how we're going to do this together. And so through the Office of Just Transition, we've created a draft plan for our states about how to move away from coal specifically. And so we're not starting with all fossil fuels, right? We want to tackle coal first, and then think about how do we then use this plan to tackle other fossil fuels and do it in the right way. We understand the urgency and we need to do it now, but we also understand that we cannot do this wrong, and that in order for us to engage the communities who are most disproportionately impacted, we actually have to take the time to not just have, as an organization, we say we're not policy experts, we're organizers. We need to be on the ground talking with people. And if we're not on the ground talking with people, then we're doing it wrong, right? And so we have created a draft plan, and I can put the link of the draft plan in the chat. And the draft plan is focuses on a couple different areas. So it has recommendations for co-workers and really thinking about like, if we're gonna move away from coal, and I think that this is at the heart, right, of like what we're thinking about here in Colorado, how do we do this in a just and equitable way, right? That we can't just say, hey, sorry, you're out of a job, we'll have different places where you can come and talk to possible employers, right? No, we actually have to offer trainings for folks to be able to transition to a new job. We have to think about housing. We have to think about if they have to move. We have to think about if they were making, you know, $80,000 and now the only jobs that they can go get are $30,000 jobs or minimum wage jobs, right? How do we make sure that we do just for the workers that are going to be losing everything that they worked for and transition them the proper way? And then we also have a section for transition for communities. So how do we think about what happens to a community if a coal plant shuts down? And it's not just looking at like the pollution and the contamination and everything else, but it's also about what's going to happen with the small businesses when community begins to leave the small town, right? What's going to happen to the local economy, and how do we make sure that we bring incentives to ensure that that community is not completely just destroyed, right? And that they actually have the economic support that they're going to need for communities to be able to continue. And how do we also make sure that communities who have been most disproportionately impacted by pollution and contaminants have an opportunity, right, to also look into this. And then we talk about fiscal issues. I think the other part that I want to mention to y'all is that, like, how do we pay for it? I think it's the big question. How do we actually pay for this transition is the big question. I would not say that we have it figured out. We have some ideas, but I think there's still a lot of work that we need to do on that. But I think that something important to say is that I think, and I don't know if this is something that has impacted folks in other countries and on other places where they're doing this work, but I think something for us is that COVID actually has had a huge impact in this work that we were moving forward. This plan is going to be presented to our legislature at the end of the year. And our goal was to really think about, our legislature starts in January next year. Really think about, like, could we actually move forward an actual bill, right, to begin this transition and begin this plan? And I think the question mark now is, due to COVID, we've had a lot of budget cuts. And our fiscal year for next year is not looking great. And I think that right now, what we're being asked is to think about legislation that's actually gonna address COVID. And so this might have to take a backseat for a little bit. And so I think that that's a situation that we're exploring too. What is the short-term and the long-term of impact of COVID in this work to move us to a just transition? And so just wanted to mention that as like a thing that's still open for us. And then I will end there, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this with you all today.
Thank you so much, Lizeth. I mean, that was fascinating, and I've already seen that there are some questions in the chat box. So could I please ask, I mean, for those who have put their questions in the chat box, to actually copy paste them and put them in the Q&A box, and for others who may have not asked their questions yet, just feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A box, so that then we can just kind of bring them all together and then present them to the speakers. So now we'll move on to the second and third speakers. Gerald Taylor Aiken, he's a research associate at the Luxembourg Institute of Socio-Economic Research. He's a geographer who studies the ways communities is used to understand, value, and relate to the environment, particularly in the context of low carbon transitions. Gerald holds a PhD from Durham University. In his thesis, he examined the production, practice, and potential of community in Edinburgh's transition town network. And he works closely with Ankit Kumar, who is a lecturer at the Department of Geography at the University of Sheffield in the UK. Ankit works on post-colonial, anti-colonial approaches for climate and energy justice issues at the nexus of culture, knowledge, and politics. For his PhD, he studied social and cultural aspects of access to modern energy in rural India. Ankit and Gerald have recently published a post-colonial critique of community energy, in which they drew on examples from India and Scotland to discuss notions of community in energy transition projects. Sorry. And so their presentation will effectively be based on that work. And I think it's Gerald who will be presenting, and Ankit is also here with us today, and he will also be there to answer questions with Gerald afterwards. So over to you, Gerald.
Okay, thanks very much, Eduardo, for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to present in this format as well. So it's great to have that. Hopefully you can see my screen now, and that has worked great, super. So I will take a more academic take than the Lizeth and the first speaker, but I think there's a lot of harmonies and synergies between what we will say that complement one another. I think both of us will look to move the just transitions discourse away from only thinking about labour issue, trade union issues, towards community, which is my own research specialism. So we're thinking more than just retraining coal workers in Germany or oil workers in Aberdeen. What does it mean, the impacts of a just transition on community, but also community itself as an active agent in trying to produce or create or drive towards a just transition. So I'll tell three stories today as we go through. The first is a very typical one, and then I want to try to play with it and problematize it a little bit. So here's an example of the use of community in a just transition. This is a picture that hopefully you can see on your screen of a street in Edinburgh. These are very typical for the centre of Edinburgh. Tenements, these are 4 stories high. These particular ones were built around 150 years ago, so they're quite poor in terms of energy efficiency performance. And it's also in a conservation area, so there's quite some restrictions for what these people can do. Well, here's an example of a project that became a showcase, a kind of lighthouse project for the Scottish Government's use of community to build position Scotland as a low carbon nation. So they threw quite a lot of money for one particular street. At this example, a group of residents, which was only around about a handful, there's up to 200 people can live on this street, but only about a handful came together, put the bid together and applied for money from the Scottish Government, and they won the funding, and they managed to carry out different retrofitting physical infrastructure to lower the carbon footprint of this particular street. And then they also carried out some social infrastructure measures as well, talked to residents about their carbon lives. And the community that's involved here, well, on the one hand, it's the handful of people, 5 to 10, who were the core group who tried to drive this project through. But in how this was presented by the Scottish Government as an example of what community can do to achieve a low carbon transition in quite a just way, was the street itself was the community. And so here are 2 more pictures of the street, and the final one is taken from Google Earth, and this top-down view really gives a nice image of the way in which community was presented here. So it was very much this one street. So people who were part of the social fabric of the street, for example, the postie who would come in every day, are not included here. People who would maybe walk their children to school in the morning, off-site, would have quite a different lived experience of community. Wouldn't necessarily know everyone, but there's a hard border and boundary that's drawn around this one particular street. And we can say community in this case means local. Now, what I want to show by the end of this is that is actually quite a problematic thing to say or to do, and that rhetoric or the elision between community and local can be more unjust than just, because we see this simplification of community in a variety of different ways that community is used environmentally. So here are some examples of coming into your screen of the types of initiatives that I'm talking about here. Today, I'm going to focus mainly on community energy initiatives, community energy projects, but there's a whole range of examples of the ways in which community is used to pursue low carbon living. Importantly, the initiatives here are not only focused, often, the ones you see on your screen are not only focused environmentally, they often advance social and often economic critiques as well. And it's this triple aspect of the social, environmental, and economic which gets confused or lost whenever community is treated in such a reified or simple way. So I want to call this as a shorthand for the rest of the talk, vanilla community. And I quite like vanilla ice cream when it's done well. But as a shorthand, as a kind of cultural trope, we talk about things as being vanilla, as in they're a bit disappointing, they're what you would expect, and there's no life or va-va-voom about them. And I think community as this vanilla form can be a bit more disappointing than exciting and crucially diverse. So again, as a kind of shorthand, people who are familiar with the just transitions discourse will see this kind of playing with words. Community is a just transition or just community involved in transition. So I want to give two more examples that try to challenge and to point out the flaws in this vanilla understanding of community. And this comes from work, it's me who's speaking right now, but it's very much a joint project, myself and Ankit. And I want to give two different examples of how we can challenge these traditional mainstream or vanilla understandings of community, like the project that I've just talked about. One particular street, one local example in quite a well-off part of the global north, this central Edinburgh street. So the first story comes from Bihar in India, and the initiative is called the Lighting a Billion Lives project. Like I said, it's a community energy scheme, an initiative, and the project here was a solar panel was installed in this village, and an entrepreneur would run the scheme, use the energy from the solar panel to light lanterns, which would then be taken at night for use in the village. And this was an energy access form of community energy rather than a transition from one fossil fuel source to renewable. This was actually people who were getting lanterns for the first time in their home. And this was used for a whole variety of different things. But existing divisions and existing tensions and social stratification meant that although this project was presented with a rhetoric of inclusivity and everyone would benefit, existing, in this case, caste stratifications played a key role in meaning that not everyone in the end was included in this project. So the map you see here is a Google Earth picture, but we've drawn on it where spatially the divisions within this village lay, so 3 different caste groups, and the entrepreneur would prefer people who they saw as being more connected to their sense of solidarity, more within their own community. So there's this rhetoric, again, like the street we talked about at the outset, of community being inclusive. That's the illusion here, not community and local, but community is everyone together. But actually in practice, it didn't quite work out that way. So taking this realization, can we then relook at the use of community involved in transition with renewed critical eyes? So I want to go back to Edinburgh, but with a different example. This is a picture of the very pretty beachfront of Portobello on the coast of Edinburgh. It's a more diverse neighbourhood than a more mixed neighbourhood than the quite well-off central Edinburgh street that we saw before. And as you can see, this is quite a pretty part of Edinburgh with a beach, and it's well known for this aspect. Here, the Community Energy Initiative here was a group of residents who came together to try to do something about persistent environmental injustice. So they wanted to lower the carbon footprint of their lives and their neighbourhood. But as is common in these community initiatives, they also wanted to do something socially and economically. So their proposal was to build what would have been Scotland's first community-owned urban wind turbine. And here are pictures that they drew up in their proposals. The group of people got together. They learned various new skills like dealing with planning regulations, how to crowdfund such a scheme. They managed to win funding from, not from government sources, but from other funds that were available for community energy initiatives and community groups. They worked really hard, but it became apparent that they were never going to get planning permission for this scheme. But the group enjoyed working together, and they really felt passionate about what they were trying to do, what they were trying to achieve. And so they then started switching to other schemes. So they tried solar panels on the roof of the local bus company, which is nearby. They tried different forms of renewable energy, and some different sites that thought might be impossible. But it became apparent that this just was never going to work. That getting planning permission for where they were located was not going to happen. And while they felt very empowered and very included in their own community, there were others who lived in the same neighborhood who actually were quite against this wind turbine and would lodge objections. They didn't want something spoiling their views, so they said. So again, taking this insight that community, as it includes, always excludes, as we learned from the Bihar example, we can see that community is more problematic here, and than just always a good thing, shall we say. So the scheme, they went forward. These were very committed, can-do individuals who acted together, and they eventually found a site where it would be possible to build their first urban community-owned wind turbine. But as you can see from this map, this location is not an urban area. It's a very rural, remote area, and it's actually hundreds of kilometers away from where this neighborhood is based in Edinburgh, halfway across Scotland. Scotland's not the biggest country in the world, but it's on the other side of Scotland, just south of Edinburgh, just south of Inverness, sorry, in a place called Daviot was the new proposed site. And the idea was that they would build these wind turbines where it is growing more and more common to have community-owned renewable energy in the periphery of Scotland, not the urban core down in the south. But the funds would be invested in the local neighbourhood in Edinburgh. And so this plays with our notion that we had at the start, that community always means local. Here is quite a translocal sense of community rather than a one where it's really restricted to being some level below city, some level below region, but something above the family, that kind of quite vanilla notion of community, how community would be scaled. So what I want to really argue for to conclude this talk is that wherever we find community in pursuit of just transition, we really have to be open to the capaciousness that community can offer us, the diversity that's there, that these communities are plural and multiple and beguiling. Simplifying them just won't do. I don't think it works in practice, and I don't think it's very helpful. I think it's quite unjust. Community is often seen, and academics like myself who study community are just as guilty of this as policymakers or activists who are trying desperately to win funds for their projects that they believe in. But it's still, community is quite often presented in this vanilla sense. The vanilla aspect takes the form of local, being inclusive, and long-lasting, but community persists. We see in the Portobello case, the wind turbine case, that these communities were quite ephemeral. They would come together to make the case for a new renewable energy initiative. When that failed, the group would dissipate somewhat and then come together again for the next initiative. And so instead of vanilla community, I want to make the case for a variety, a plurality of flavors, pistachio, rum and raisin, mint chocolate chip, and lots of sprinkles on the top as well. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm intrigued to hear if you have any questions or comments in the Q&A box.
Thank you, Gerald. So I guess we'll switch directly over to questions. So just please feel free to to type your questions in the Q&A box if you haven't done so yet. So I might just start off with a question for Lizeth from Joe Cutter. And it's a question that I think is, it's an interesting question because it touches on, at one point you mentioned your work with AFL-CIO. And so her question is, in your dialogues with unions, what did you learn from them and what do you think they learned from you? So could you give us a bit more kind of information on how that kind of interaction with unions, how it took place and what you kind of learned from it?
Yeah, and I would just add for context that I think for us, we have a great relationship with unions, but I think our relationship is a little bit different because we don't walk on it just to work on just transition. As an organization that has been working on economic justice issues, we've been on the fight with the unions for worker justice for a really long time, and we've been fighting together to increase the minimum wage. We've been fighting for, worker protections and all those things. And so I think when we started the conversations of just transition, we already had the background, right, of like their members knew that like as COPA as an organization, we might disagree slightly, right, on this concept, but like we were there and we have fought with them. We've been on the streets with them. And so I think that kind of was a little bit different. So I'll just start by putting that context there, because I think it's important that we didn't walk into a relationship on this work specifically only. We had already been working together. And so I think that the trust and the relationship was already there that allowed us to have different conversations. And I would say, I think with the unions, I think like there's a huge understanding on the work, because I think for us as an organization, workers' rights are critical, and we've always been sort of part of that work. I think where we had to do a little bit of work and a little bit of education and pushing, and I think that that's something that all the unions, not just here at like the AFL-CIO, understand, is that there's so much work on race that has to happen within our union movements, just period. Like no one can deny that, right? Like there's so much work to do on race. And so I think for us as an organization, I think that's where we had like deep conversations with the different unions about racial justice and what does that mean? And racial justice in the concept of just transition, but also other issues, right? And I think as an organization, our staff is 100% people of color. Most of our staff are immigrants. We work, 90% of our members are people of color. A lot of our members are low income. I think that positioned us to be the ones to have those conversations. And so I think that allowed us to have some conversations about how do we think about disproportionately impacted communities at the same level that we're thinking about workers, because we can't do it without thinking about both. But I think there's still some challenges and some work to do. And I would not say just with the unions. I think the community as a whole, I think that climate it's complex, that when sometimes you say disproportionately impacted communities, people are like, oh, we're all impacted by climate change. We all drive by an area that's overly polluted, right? And for us, the important thing is it's really ensuring that people understand that disproportionately impacted is, for us, it's environmental racism, right? There's certain parts in our communities where we're okay with putting a refinery, where we're okay with putting a coal plant. But if that goes somewhere else, in a community that's more affluent, in a community that is white, there will be a problem if we try to do that, right? We had that situation here in Northern Colorado in one of the fracking sites, right? They were trying to put a fracking site in a community that was mostly white. And, everyone was crying out like, how could you do this? And then they turned around and put it right behind a school that's 90% Latino kids. And that was somehow okay, right? And so I think that that's the tension that as an organization, we're trying to bring with everyone that we're working with, right? About like who is actually disproportionately impacted. And that's the work that we've been doing with unions and with other folks that are part of this work to move us to a just transition, to really kind of push the envelopes and ensure that, we all kind of understand who we're talking about when we're talking about disproportionately impacted communities. But yeah, our relationship with the unions has been a little bit different just because of the history that we have with them.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think at one point you raised a point on on how effectively, I mean, from what I understand, what you're saying is that effectively community organizing is not restricted to other kind of disenfranchised, kind of poorer, kind of working class, people of color, kind of communities who are kind of the most directly at risk. It actually also applies to actually very affluent communities, and they're possibly very good as well at organizing at the community level. And I think that that really kind of bounces quite well with what Gerald was saying when he was giving an example of the street in Edinburgh. Here we have kind of a case of a street in a neighborhood that is quite affluent, where people are organizing as well effectively as a community. And so you could almost argue that in some cases, community consciousness, or the consciousness of being a community, is sometimes even stronger in more affluent areas than in areas that are kind of most at risk, and where, you know, there are so many kind of challenges as well. So that's, you know, that's just made me think of that, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I guess, I mean, there are loads of questions, so I'm going to try and just kind of read through them very quickly. I mean, there's a question for Gerald. I think it says, what shaped the I mean, the question, I think it relates to the Scotland example. What shaped the emergence of the issue community that finally enabled the community-based energy initiative? And what lessons are there for facilitating this sort of non-local community action for transition in practice? So I guess, yeah, could you provide us a bit more kind of information on, you know, how that kind of community-based initiative kind of came about? You know, what was the kind of triggering factor, I guess, that kind of led to that initiative taking place?
Yeah, so that particular group actually came from a supermarket protest, and so they were completely unrelated to any environmental issue. Well, you could argue there is an environmental component, but they were actually focused on issues to do with Save the High Street and not wanting one big out-of-town superstore in their neighborhood. And so the group came together in order to prevent this supermarket being built in their neighborhood, and they were successful. They managed to stop the building of the supermarket. But that forming of a community around an issue, here a kind of economic food relocalization type issue, they decided, yeah, we quite enjoy being together, we enjoy each other's company. But it wasn't a community that was based on location per se. It was a community that was very much based around an issue, like the question says. And so then it became focusing on environmental issues. So this is outlined in the paper that I mentioned, which is open access. So please feel free to look at it. You don't have to belong to a Western university to get access to this particular paper. But yeah, so the history goes back even further than just environmental issues. And what I found really interesting from an academic theory of community point of view was this wasn't a community as a container used to allocate people. So you live on that street, you're in that community, or you are a member of the Jewish community, or you're a member of the gay community, or these were the ways in which community is used. But these were people who chose to collectivize their subjectivity and to use that to increase their agency. They were able to do more collectively than they were as individuals. And so I think that's a really interesting, that's another way to use community. It's not to say one exists, the other doesn't. Both clearly exist, but it's interesting to try to add that alongside this more reified view of community. Community is a way to do more. So in answer to the question, the original issue was the supermarket, but it really cascaded through a variety of different issues that the group then coalesced around.
And then there was a question, I mean, from Sumit. I guess this relates more to the kind of India case study that you kind of referred to. So maybe this, I don't know if Gerald or Ankit, you also want to step in maybe. She asks about kind of just transitions in Bihar, India, I guess in relation as well to the case study you mentioned, but I guess also bouncing back on what Gerald was saying in terms of this, I mean, the example that you gave, I think in the presentation, was these lanterns. And so there was clearly kind of an external kind of actor kind of coming in. So I guess what would be interesting, I guess, is if you could also maybe elaborate more on kind of whether or not it's the fact that there was an external intervention that kind of suddenly generated this kind of sense of belonging to a group or to a community in terms of the kind of struggles as well to kind of benefit from these lanterns, or whether or not, you know, the kind of community feeling or sense it already kind of pre-existed, that kind of outside intervention.
Should I take that, Jerry? Yeah. Thanks, Edouard. That's really interesting and important question. I think one of the main arguments that we set up in this paper is that community sort of comes through, or what we see community comes through a combination of pre-existing solidarities and emergent purposes. So that's that external intervention and what existed there already. They come together to show us where boundaries of communities are laid out. So in the Bihar part of the paper also we show that while in the case of lanterns there's these caste-based formations or privileging caste relationships generally taken over by upper caste people, or in the race language we can say taken up by the white people, and excluding lower caste people. And we observed that in case of national grid, in which the network, socio-technical network is different, where disconnecting people is much more difficult. This plays out in a different way, and that more people are able to claim share in that in various ways. So I think that's an important point that we make in the paper, is that one form of identity does not exclude another form of identity, that all of these exist at the same time, and that they reveal themselves in different ways depending on what is on offer, how much is on offer, and who gets to grab that. So, and then from that, and from that, I want to jump onto this question of what is a just transition then in this case. And I think that's a very important question. And I think it connects quite well with what Liz was just talking about. This issue of race and caste are obviously quite complementary issue in a sense. And I want to go back. And so what we see in this case, in our case, in the caste case, I wrote a paper a couple of years ago about justice and politics in access to energy. It's on energy research and social sciences, also open access. And there I talk about how what we see in these projects is that often people who already are in privileged position end up extending their privileges through these projects and benefiting most from them. And people who are less privileged ends up getting excluded, or in Liz language, ends up getting left with the waste or with the harmful technologies. And so I want to think through what is a just transition and what is a more inclusive community. I want to go back to what postcolonial theory draws from a work of Frantz Fanon or from Dipesh Chakravarti and Ashish Nandi, is that if we look between the privileged and the underprivileged has never seen privilege. So the privileged people, let's say if in the question of race, they talk about slave and master. A master has always seen the slave as a thing, not as a human, inhuman, right? But a slave has always seen the master as a human. So the community of the slave is much more inclusive, and the community of the master is much more exclusionary. And therefore, to think about this at some point, I think we need to go down to the lowest level of underprivilege and think about how do we build a more, a community of which has a higher level of conscience, which includes more and excludes fewer. Sorry, that was
Great.
It was too academic.
Great, thanks a lot. Sorry for the noise in the background. My children are just coming back from school. Sorry about that. That was just completely unexpected. Great. Well, sorry. So just bouncing back, I mean, I think in relation to, again, kind of the point that Lizeth brought out about, and the kind of idea that, and in a way as well, that Gerald referred to in relation to the fact that community also applies to people who have privilege. I just kind of like to raise a question that Deborah that Deborah refers to. Sorry again. She talks about she talks about transition times and the transition time movement. So I'm just going to read through her question, which I find really interesting. The international transitions times movement has largely been led by more affluent white middle-class volunteers. There is desire and willingness to develop a more diverse and socially just transition through transition groups and initiatives. What advice would you give to white-led community groups like transition time initiatives who would like to be more involved in a just transition and ally with or uplift the voices and needs of marginalized voices in their local areas? So I don't know if, I guess this is kind of a very open question to all of you, but maybe Lizeth, do you want to just begin by responding to that? And then I can maybe ask the others.
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because I think it's a perfect question for the conversation that we've been having right now. I'll start by saying that I think there's something that's really important for us to understand. And it's not that our communities, specifically communities of color and low-income communities, don't care about these issues and that they don't want to get involved. The fact of the matter is that they have this thing to worry about and 10 other things that they're worrying about, that they have to think, what am I going to prioritize this week to handle and address in order to support my family? And so I would say an example, because as organizers, we do our work through stories, right? And so this year, we usually go door knocking to talk to families and to talk to people. And this year we did phone bankings, right? And so the group of our members that we're calling community, specifically a community that's around a refinery, we were calling them to talk about pollution, right? And air quality and all of those things. And we could not get folks to talk to us about anything related to climate, because all people could tell us was, I don't know if I'm gonna live here at the end of the month because I cannot pay my rent. Right. And so when you're talking about how do we organize people into working on these issues, you have to walk in with the understanding that for a white community, that's affluent, they don't have to worry about rent, right? They don't have to worry about if they're going to actually have dinner that night, right? And a lot of our families that we work with, they have 1, 2, or 3 jobs, right? And they're still struggling to make ends meet. And they have to choose a lot of the times, do I pay rent or do we go on 1 meal a day, because we can't afford to do both. And so you cannot just walk in with like, how can you not care about what's happening and like, let's bring you on, because there's so many other things. And you have to walk in with the understanding that our communities are facing so many other things. And that's why they're not organizing to that level, right? But I would say like our communities have been organized and they've been fighting back, and they've been fighting far hard. And the other thing that I would add that's a challenge too, that I think it's important to mention, is that how we are heard. And I don't know if this happens in other countries, right? But I know that in the United States, it's really real and really present, right? And it comes with the issue of race, right? Like I tell folks, the Capitol building was not built for people that are like me. I'm a light-skinned Latina, but at the end of the day, I'm still an immigrant from Mexico, right? That building was not created to work for me. And so the amount of work that I have to do to bring the issues that my community cares about are 10 times harder than if it was a white person walking into that building. And so that is also another thing that we have to have in mind when the challenges that our communities face in actually like advocating and organizing on the issues that are impacting us. And my advice will be, I would say, don't start with a campaign. Don't start with like, hey, you should join me for this. Start with learning and understanding the community. Get to know them, build relationships. And then also don't walk in with like, I have this policy idea that I think we should do, right? Ask people, what do you think we should be doing to address this issue that's impacting you? And it's also impacting me. And so I would say the approach cannot just be, here's a policy, like, why don't we work on it together? It has to be an approach of, let me learn about your community, let me learn from you, let me get to know you, build a relationship, and come up with a solution together. Because I think a lot of the movements, the climate movement in the United States has been really white for a really long time. And it's just recently that we've started to see a transition, right? Of like more communities of color, more leaders of color really getting involved. And the problem has been is that you have people that come in that don't understand what's happening. And all they do is say, we need to do this, right? And that approach doesn't work. It has to be something that is built together. And so that would be my advice in how to approach that situation.
And again, I kind of feel that this kind of there's a lot of parallels to be drawn with what happened in the India example that was given with the lanterns. It's the same kind of thing. It's kind of people coming in and just saying, okay, here's what you need to do. And so I don't know if Ankit, you'd like to also maybe respond to the question or to what Lizeth just said.
No, I think I agree that it is quite similar in that sense, somewhat of a patronizing relationship. And I think I would totally agree with Lizeth that this, again, obviously our conceptual repertoire comes from post-colonial theory. So again, drawing on that, this idea of unlearning and relearning and opening yourself up to listening and understanding is quite important. So one of the things that we encountered, Gerald would remember, is that this conversation about our paper started from the question of language, the question of how does this idea of community translate, and that the idea of community itself being coming from Western Europe and coming top down to rest of the world. And in other parts of the world, in other languages, people understand these solidarities or these bonds of togetherness through different concepts, different ideas, different words. So I think that question of opening oneself to I know that Lizeth was talking more about the movement itself, but I think on a conceptual level also, opening oneself to learning, forgetting what we know and learning, relearning is quite important. Does that sound okay, Gerald, or would you add to that?
Gerald, yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't want to take away from what's been said. I think that's exactly right. That's where we were coming from theoretically. I think one thing I would add tangentially, was a direct response to the question, was advice for groups or movements for community-based activism that finds itself in a situation where they're too white and want to deal with that somehow. That was my reading. The question's gone, but that was my reading of the question. I think there's a great paper on this in Environmental Politics, written by Emily Creamer and her master's student, and they looked at specifically at transition town groups. And if you can't find it, please just send me an email or contact me through Twitter, and I'll be happy to keep the conversation going with you. But one thing I would add to that, firstly, I think it's fine for groups from maybe a middle-class English village who find themselves being all white. I don't think we can load too much expectations on activists. And if that group is, they're not, I don't want to blame them I don't want to blame them for all the evils that befall the world. Nevertheless, what I'm going to say is, I think Extinction Rebellion found this out last year, where they got into a bit of trouble to do with race and racist issues, where they found in a structural injustice like racism, if you're not explicitly anti-racist, it's almost inevitable that you will then repeat the structural injustices you see in the society around you. And so these are groups and movements who are primarily focused on environmental issues, unless they are explicitly anti-racist, it's almost inevitable that they will end up repeating some of these structural injustices to do with race. And the same goes for other structural injustices that we see in society. And so the question was specifically about transition towns, but I think there's a useful analogy there in the case that blew up in Extinction Rebellion in the UK last year, where there were some useful lessons that were learned about needing to really be quite explicit and direct about not only what they're for, and I think part of what I'm trying to do is allied with that, to say these forms of exclusion and boundaries are inevitable, and what's more problematic is pretending that we're all in it together and that everyone is treated the same. It's about saying, no, these divisions and social stratifications exist, and raising them into consciousness. I think that's that's something that I see as being quite useful, and transition probably could learn a bit from that, actually. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Gerald. I mean, again, I guess in relation to this kind of conversation, there's a really interesting point and question, but I guess point from Kumar in the chat box, who refers to the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy in India. I think he's referring to example in India. He says, that it's happening without questioning how renewable energies are being developed. And what kind of the implications are as well for communities. So it's kind of questioning this kind of idea as well that renewable energies are inherently good, in particular for communities. And I think that's a really as well kind of a really relevant point and question. I guess there was one question. I'm trying to find them. There are just so many great questions. I think it was a question on for you, Lizeth, on the issue of funding. You mentioned at one point that there was these plans that were being developed, and that kind of one of the big questions is how do you finance it? So I guess I would be, I think the question was basically, if I remember it correctly, given the current context as well. I mean, I guess I had to mention COVID at one point in our conversation, right? How is that going to kind of change the landscape? What do you see in terms of these opportunities to kind of finance these kind of transition projects and these transition efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. It's a hard question because I think that that's the big thing that we haven't answered, right? And it's really hard. I think in Colorado specifically, it doesn't apply to the entire country, right? We have a thing called the Taxpayer Bill of Rights that just prohibits a lot of the things that we do around taxes or anything else. And I know that some folks have been really kind of coming together to really think about like this issue of taxes, and how can that kind of shift some things to really help us to do some changes. And I know there's also been conversations, under this administration, we had massive tax cuts to the top wealthiest of wealthiest. Our state also just passed another tax cut to the same people. And so instead of thinking about just tax cuts, can we actually create systems where our tax rate is progressive, right? So not everyone is getting the same tax amount. And if we make it progressive with that increased amount of money that will be coming to the state, could that be used, for things like that? I know that we talked about money for education and other things as well on this, but like those are some of the conversations that are exploring. And then I think for us as an organization, we do a lot of corporate accountability, right? What is the role of the corporations that have actually been polluting and contaminating our communities to pay for the transition? And I think that that's also another question that we've been grappling with, of like, how do we make sure that we also kind of put it on the same corporations that have been making a lot of money from this kind of the work that they're doing and the contamination and the pollution that they're putting in our communities. And how do we say, now you have to also be part of funding this transition, right, to help our communities? And so I think that that's another question. So I don't think I have like a specific answer. I think we just have questions. And if someone has figured it out, I would love to learn that to see if we can implement it here. And then one last thing that I would mention is that, and it's also a big unknown, but as you all know, we just went through an election. And so we have a new administration coming in next year. I think we're still waiting to see, the results from Georgia, and see if we actually have a democratically controlled Senate as well, or if we're going to be split. But, there's the Green New Deal and the Thrive Resolution. And I think that those are like two kind of big national moments that could really shift a lot of things for the United States when it comes to this issue. And if we're able to move forward the Green New Deal or components of it, right, that could really fuel money to the states to really think about how do we transition to a renewable energy economy. And the Green New Deal has a lot of components on impacted communities and impacted workers and a lot of things. And so I think that that's the other thing that we all kind of have to wait and see, what's going to be the outcome, right? And how is our Congress going to look like next year? And is there going to be political appetite from our elected officials? And what's the push that our community is going to do to really think about a national solution to this issue? And I think that that's one that I think we're all kind of waiting for, and we're going to work and organize for, but I think that that could shift a lot of things for the United States moving forward.
Thanks a lot. And I guess kind of bouncing off of that, and this is maybe a question for Gerald, or maybe also Ankit. When in your discussion, what I find really interesting is, as I loved your ice cream kind of examples, and I guess what came out of that, and kind of one of the questions I was asking myself was almost as if, from the moment that we speak of community, are we inevitably, does that inevitably mean that we will kind of end up only kind of, what possibilities did that give in terms of organizing, for instance, at the national level, kind of bouncing off what Lizeth was saying about, bringing this up, to the national level, putting pressure at the national level. I mean, the notion, the very notion of community almost kind of implies this kind of idea that we are kind of restricted to the very kind of localized. So I was wondering if you had kind of any ideas or any thoughts on, how that kind of community voice, can be brought up, while kind of maintaining that kind of diversity and kind of recognizing what you were saying effectively, that no two communities are alike, and that the boundaries are also very different, depending on who we focus on. So how do we translate that politically, I would say, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've got lots, and yeah, I think what's important to me is just that realization, which I see as lacking, which is that kind of social glue, the ties that bind one to another, are not restricted to given characteristics or facts about our identity, like where we're born, or our gender, or our sexuality, or race, or whatever. But that social glue can be produced, and it can be produced through struggle, through there's a Scottish community organizer who said that the only thing that builds community is a common demanding task. And so these three elements were there: the something in common, something demanding, so it costs something of you, and it was a task to work on. So that's quite a different sense of community than this allocated, a given sense of community, like you live in that street, therefore you belong to your neighbor. And I don't want to say that that doesn't exist, but it's much more than that, much more than that. So then the second part of your question, which is putting that to use, I think they're regularly put to use. I think feelings of solidarity and belonging are regularly mobilized by a whole range of different people, whether advertisers, commercially, but also politically. What's interesting to me is not just people who use community, but the way in which community itself starts using issues and shaping agenda. So there's a question of power and agency that I would want to put into your question. And in a way, this is maybe the question that's going to motivate my whole career. So I'm not going to be able to find a snappy ice cream based analogy to answer. But I think it's absolutely fascinating, and beguiling was the word I used. And I still can't look away whenever these issues, whenever these questions come up. So I would say no, it's not either or. It's yes and both, more.
Great, thanks a lot. And I don't know if Ankit, you had any maybe kind of final thoughts as well that you want to share. I mean, because I guess we have 1 minute left, but I'd really like to hear your views as well to finish. Thanks a lot,
Edouard. This is also thanks for the easy question. This is a low ball. How do we get this moving politically? I don't know, actually. Like Gerald said, this is important work, I think, for the coming time that we need to think about. And I keep going back to the same idea that we need to perhaps think about the subaltern. I don't want to use the word communities, but maybe I have to because I don't have any other word in my vocabulary. But we have to look more towards the subaltern communities and see what they what they are activating, and how do we work with those activisms to take forward, rather than looking at more elite communities. And we do make this point in the paper that we want to talk about communities because it is being operationalized as much in the name of subaltern as in the name of elite. But that question of who excludes and who is more inclusive is something that I think we need to, is an important question that we need to stick to. The earlier question, I was reminded of this podcast that I was listening a few weeks ago. It's called Nice White Parents. It's about these families in New York who move into schools which were earlier mostly communities of color, students or children of color, and they move in there and they start asking for these things that would improve the education. So French classes or horse riding. I'm just throwing examples, but I remember French class was one of them. And they start taking over the whole school in the idea of making it better from their perspective. And they start excluding people from the board of people of color from the board of the school, from decision making, and they start overriding. And I think those are important things for us to put in center when we think about just community transition.
That's really great. I mean, that's a perfect ending, I think, Ankit. So thanks a lot. And again, thank you, Lizeth, Ankit, and Gerald for joining us, for your contribution, for your really kind of interesting insights and ideas. A lot of the articles and reports and proposals that you mentioned have been added to the chat box. But unfortunately, I mean, we haven't been able to go through all the questions, but what we will do is we will forward the questions to the speakers for them to also be able to kind of respond to them. So thank you as well to everyone who has asked questions today. So I guess just before wrapping up, just a quick reminder to fill in the feedback survey, which is extremely useful to us. So it just takes 1 minute basically. So please fill the survey out if you can. Thank you again to the speakers. Thanks to the attendees, to everyone who joined. Thank you to Sergio, Dunya, and Akiko for organizing, for setting everything up. It was really fantastic as usual. And I guess I'll just say just mention that we have our next webinar, which is the final webinar of this series, which will take place on the 9th of December. So it's going to be kind of a wrapping up webinar, sorry. And the title is Just Transition, Power and Politics. So it will be on the 9th of December. We will be sending you the registration link. So please do join us for this final seminar of the year. Webinar, again, I keep mixing those words up. But anyway, it was great to have you all, and talk to you soon.